For 72 years, her world had been the old house on Satcham Creek, a place that smelled more like a library than a home, the scent of aging paper and leather binding clinging to the very air she breathed. She was the self-appointed guardian of her father's legacy, the famous historian Arthur Vance. Her son, Ben, served as a gentle but persistent reminder of the world outside. His Sunday visits were marked by the same loving plea, his eyes sweeping over the towering shelves and glass-fronted cabinets. "Mom, this place is a museum," he would say, his voice soft with concern. "It's time to let go." But how could she? Letting go felt like a profound betrayal, an erasure of her life's purpose. Her entire existence was inextricably tied to his work, and more importantly, to the unspoken promise that one day he would tell her the real story. It was a promise that had died with him 20 years ago, leaving a cavernous void she had tried to fill with meticulous preservation and quiet order. The house was not merely wood and nails. It was a grand testament to the monumental man she thought she knew. Within its walls, however, the ghost of that private, unfulfilled promise still walked the halls. In the deep quiet of the evenings, she would catch herself listening, her body still and her breath held, for the familiar creak of his footsteps on the stairs, a faint, hopeful ache blooming in her chest, in a constant, lonely vigil. For compelling narratives that explore the ghosts of the past and the secrets we keep, subscribe. We delve into the heart of characters and the stories that define them. Don't miss a single one. The plane cut through clouds that looked like pillows of cotton, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of untethered freedom. Down below, Ben was probably pacing, convinced I was walking into a trap. But up here, suspended between the life I knew and the one I was about to uncover, his voice was just a faint echo. The air in the cabin was stale, recycled, but to me, it smelled of possibility. I clutched the letter in my carry-on, the paper now softened by my constant touch. It wasn't just a legal document, it was a map to a hidden room in my father's meticulously constructed house. A room that had a name, Isabel. Arizona was a shock to the system. The heat hit me like a physical blow as I stepped out of the airport, a dry, baking warmth that seemed to pull the moisture right out of my skin. It was a landscape of stark contrasts, sharp, red rocks against a relentlessly blue sky. Nothing like the gentle greens and muted grays of home. The lawyer's office was in a low, adobe-style building, the air inside cooled to a near-Arctic temperature. A man with a kind, weathered face and a bolo tie introduced himself as Mr. Abernathy. He didn't look like a purveyor of scams. He looked like he'd seen 1,000 stories like mine, and 1,000 more that were stranger still. "Your father and Isabel knew each other a long time ago," he began, his voice gentle, as he slid a small lacquered box across the polished wooden desk. "Before he met your mother, they were very close." He let the words hang in the air, a silent invitation for me to fill in the blanks with sordid drama. But as my trembling fingers lifted the lid of the box, my breath caught. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not a cache of torrid love letters, but a single, worn photograph. It showed my father, impossibly young, his hair unruly, a smudge of paint on his cheek. His arm was draped casually around a laughing woman with a wild mane of dark hair. Isabel. They stood before a half-finished canvas, a riot of color and emotion. He wasn't the stern patriarch I remembered. He was a boy, vibrant and full of a light I had never witnessed. He was an artist. A very promising one, Mr. Abernathy confirmed softly. Isabel was his muse. When his own father forced him to join the family business, to choose a more respectable path, he gave it all up. He gave her up. He asked Isabel to keep this part of him locked away. She honored his wish right until the end. The inheritance wasn't money. It was this box. It was the truth. The marble statue hadn't just cracked. It had crumbled. revealing the passionate, conflicted young man it had been built to conceal. For the first time, I felt I was truly meeting him. The ripples were just beginning to reach the shore, washing away everything I thought I knew, leaving behind a story that was finally, achingly, my own. The air-conditioned chill of the Scottsdale bank was a stark, sterile counterpoint to the blistering Arizona heat that shimmered on the asphalt outside. For Eleanor, the impersonal gleam of marble floors and the hushed, reverent silence were a universe removed from the comforting, nostalgic scent of lemon oil and aging paper that had always defined her father's study, a scent she now realized might have been a facade. A clerk, whose face remained a polite and professional blank, slid a heavy metal safety deposit box across the polished counter. Her hands, suddenly betraying her with a fine tremor, reached for it. The cold, unyielding weight of the box felt significant, a final, tangible piece of the man she thought she knew. With a sense of quiet dread that tightened her chest, she lifted the lid. Her breath caught. There was no fortune, no carefully managed portfolio, none of the practical remnants of a life meticulously planned. Instead, the box contained only a stack of brittle letters, bundled with a silk ribbon faded to a ghost of its original color, lying beside a small, unassuming leather-bound journal whose cover was worn smooth by touch. Choosing a letter at random, she carefully untied the ribbon, its fibers frail against her fingers. She unfolded the delicate paper. The script was instantly, painfully recognizable, her father's familiar, elegant hand, the same hand that had signed her report cards and written her birthday wishes. The words, however, were those of a complete stranger. This was not the stoic, reserved father who had raised her. This was a man laid bare, a man consumed by a passionate, almost desperate love for a woman she had never heard of, Isabel. He wrote of Isabel's spirit, likening it to the wild, untamable landscape she called home. He wrote of her profound, almost sacred connection to her land, to her family on the Umatilla Reservation. Each sentence was a revelation, painting a vivid, agonizing picture of a secret life, a hidden heart that had beaten for someone else entirely. Eleanor read on, feeling like a trespasser in the most intimate corners of her father's soul. Then came the line, stark and brutal on the page, that stopped her own heart and seemed to suck all the air from the cold room. "I will tell Eleanor and her mother, and then I will be with you." The implication crashed over her with the force of a physical blow. He was going to leave them, her and her mother. The man she had idolized, the unwavering pillar of her existence, had been fully prepared to shatter their lives and walk away. This secret, unearthed in a cold bank vault, was the first tremor. It was the terrifying initial jolt that fractured the very foundation of her world, making her realize the ground she had so confidently walked upon her entire life had never been solid at all. Still reeling from her discovery, Eleanor Vance clutched the precious journal as she walked out of the bank into the blinding Arizona sun. Suddenly, a man stepped directly into her path. "Eleanor Vance?" he inquired. He was tall, with kind eyes that held a familiar sort of pain, a sorrow she felt she understood. "My name is Silas Blackwood. Isabel was my great-aunt." The connection was instant and unsettling. He wasn't a friend or an admirer of her father's work, he quickly established. He was a history professor, he explained, and had been searching for Isabel's story for years, a search that had now brought him to Eleanor. "I believe that journal you're holding contains her history," he stated, his voice gentle but firm, his gaze locked on the book she held. "And I believe your father took it from her." The accusation, sharp and unbelievable, hung in the dry desert air between them. He didn't want a family heirloom or a memento. What he sought was something he called justice. The flight back to Pendleton was agonizing. The journal in his carry-on felt like a ticking bomb, heavy with secrets he was terrified to uncover. Upon walking back into his house, the familiar, once comforting scent of his father's study felt cloying, a beautiful lie made manifest in the air. The rows of his father's acclaimed books, the very volumes he had dedicated his life to preserving, now seemed to mock him from their shelves. He sank into the worn leather chair, his father's sacred spot, the place from which he had dispensed wisdom and quiet affection. With trembling hands, he opened the journal. The elegant script filled the pages, not with the expected historical analysis, but with a raw, emotional turmoil completely alien to the reserved man he had always known. His father wrote of Isabel, but also confessed to a dark path and an irreversible choice that had plagued his nights, shattering the perfect image of the man he thought he knew. In the profound silence of the house, punctuated only by the soft whisper of turning pages, the journal had become a nightly obsession. Its worn leather cover, smooth and cool, felt alive beneath the reader's fingertips, a portal to a past that was both intimately familiar and terrifyingly unknown. Each entry pulled the reader deeper, away from the safety of the present and into the intricate world the father had inhabited. What had begun as the discovery of a passionate love story soon revealed its true nature. The words, laid bare in an elegant, sloping script, were not merely a chronicle of affection. They formed a weighty confession, an unburdening of a soul. The father's voice, so often remembered as pragmatic and grounded in academic certainty, transformed completely on the page. He wrote with a profound, almost spiritual reverence for a woman named Isabel. It was her mind, her heritage, her very essence that had truly captivated him, far beyond simple romance. He described in painstaking, vivid detail the immense richness of her tribal knowledge, the complex oral histories, the medicinal properties of native plants, the creation stories passed down through countless generations. With a stark and uncharacteristic humility, he admitted how his own years of methodical research and documented facts paled in comparison to this living, breathing legacy of wisdom. His world of dusty books and catalogued artifacts could never capture the vibrant ancestral truth she carried within her. Yet a subtle shift in the ink's pressure, a growing urgency in the prose, heralded a chilling change in tone. Woven into the tapestry of this beautiful connection was a dark, persistent thread of foreboding. The narrative grew tense, the spaces between words heavy with unspoken fears. The father wrote of Isabel's brother, a man portrayed not as a simple antagonist, but as a stoic guardian of his people's ways, a figure of unshakable conviction whose protective presence complicated every secret meeting. Alongside this delicate familial tension, a more ominous conflict was brewing with a powerful unnamed figure in the region, a person of immense influence whose unseen interests seemed to threaten the very land and traditions the father had come to so deeply admire. The amorphous sense of dread finally solidified into a palpable weight with one particular entry, the script slightly unsteady, as if penned by a trembling hand. "A choice has been made," he had written, "one from which there is no return. I am caught in the gears of it." The words were a cryptic, haunting puzzle, missing most of its crucial pieces, yet their emotional gravity was absolute and suffocating. They hung in the still air of the room, demanding to be understood, to be felt. It was a chilling revelation that reframed every loving passage and scholarly observation that had come before. This was not simply the story of a forbidden love affair, constrained by cultural differences or familial disapproval. The journal was a testament to something far more perilous, a dangerous, binding secret he had become a part of, a commitment from which he could not or would not escape. The gears he mentioned were still turning somewhere out in the world, and by reading his confession, a new person was now caught listening to their inexorable grinding motion. A few days later, he was there. Eleanor had been seeking a sliver of normalcy at the grocery store, the mundane task of buying milk and bread, a flimsy shield against the turmoil brewing within her. But normalcy was a luxury she no longer had. Silas was waiting in her own driveway as she returned, standing beside her car as if summoned from the very earth of Sachem Creek. He hadn't called. He had simply appeared, a stark, physical embodiment of the questions that were tearing her apart. "Eleanor, you can't hide from this," he said, his voice low but insistent. The patience he had shown before had clearly worn thin, replaced by a raw, frayed urgency. My family's story was silenced. He didn't just have theories, he had brought evidence. Without waiting for a response, he laid out a collection of photocopies across the warm hood of her car, creating a mosaic of a past she didn't recognize. There were old maps, their landmarks different from the official versions she knew. There were faded letters from his family, filled with a history she had never been taught, and there were notes from interviews, transcripts from elders whose accounts directly and damningly contradicted the published histories of her own father. Each document was a stone thrown at the glass house of her life. Then came the second twist, the one that shattered everything. Silas's gaze was unwavering, pinning her in place with the weight of his accusation. He didn't just love her, Eleanor. He stole her voice. The words were sharp, precise, and utterly devastating. His career, your house, your whole life, it's all built on the history he plagiarized from her. The world seemed to tilt, the comfortable home behind her suddenly looking like a monument to a terrible lie. The life she had known was not a history, it was a forgery. Silas's words hung in the sudden, ringing silence, each one a hammer blow against the edifice of her life. The realization struck with the force of a physical impact. Her life's work, the meticulous preservation of her father's legacy, had not been an act of devotion. It was an act of erasure, a careful, curated lie. A dizzying vertigo seized her, as if the very floor had fallen away, leaving her suspended over an abyss of deceit. Her body trembled with a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Stumbling back inside the house that was no longer a sanctuary, but a museum of falsehoods, she reached for the phone, her hands unsteady. There was only one person she thought could anchor her in this maelstrom, one voice that could be a lifeline. "Ben!" she managed to say, the name cracking, fragile in the heavy air. The hope that had flickered in her chest was instantly extinguished. He cut her off before she could plead, his own voice ablade, tight with a frustration that had clearly been simmering for a long time. "Mom, I can't." The words were clipped, devoid of warmth. "I told you this would happen. You went looking for this, and I can't be a part of it. Call me when you're ready to sell the house and move on." The click of the disconnected line was deafening. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than before. It wasn't just silence, it was a void. In the space of a single day, the two pillars that had supported the entire structure of her world, the unwavering belief in her father's integrity and the steadfast comfort of her son's support, had simultaneously turned to dust. The weight of it all, the history she had tried to uphold and the future she had just lost, pressed down on her, leaving her utterly, terrifyingly alone in the ruins. She moved through the familiar rooms with the weightless, aimless detachment of a ghost. It was her home, yet she felt like a tourist wandering through a stranger's life, a meticulously curated museum of falsehoods. The air, thick with the scent of old paper and lemon polish, was suffocating. An oppressive silence reigned, broken only by the mournful creak of floorboards beneath her hesitant steps. She ran a hand over the spines of her father's books, a formidable collection that lined the study from floor to ceiling. Each volume, once a source of immense pride and a symbol of his intellectual prowess, now felt like a stolen artifact, its weight a sham. The embossed titles seemed to mock her from their leather-bound perches. On the mahogany-paneled walls, the array of awards and framed accolades gleamed with a cold, false light, their polished surfaces reflecting a distorted, hollow version of her own face. It was all a lie, a breathtaking, life-consuming fraud that she had spent her years diligently, blindly maintaining. Her entire life had been an act of careful curation, of polishing his legacy, while her own identity gathered dust in the unlit corners of their shared existence. The revelation settled not like a sudden storm, but like a slow, creeping fog. chilling her to the bone. Her gaze, shadowed with a grief too deep for tears, fell upon a dusty, leather-bound portfolio tucked away in a corner, almost completely obscured by a heavy velvet curtain. With a trembling hand, she pulled it into the dim light. It was filled with her own watercolors, vibrant yet time-faded paintings of the winding creek and the sun-dappled woods she had loved as a girl. Decades had passed since she had last touched them, since she had allowed herself the simple, honest joy of mixing color and water. She had let her own art, her own quiet story, told in hues of green and blue, fade into an irrelevant background. It was a necessary sacrifice, she had told herself for years, to keep his narrative, his brilliant public persona, polished and bright. Now the truth was stark and unavoidable. She wasn't just his devoted daughter, the keeper of his flame. She had been a willing accomplice to his profound silence, a co-conspirator in the grand deception. And in the process of guarding his secrets, she had irrevocably silenced the most essential parts of herself, becoming a ghost in her own story. In a moment of absolute despair, she collapsed against her father's imposing mahogany desk, the somber centerpiece of the fraudulent museum he had built. Her hand slid limply across the polished surface, a familiar plane she had dusted thousands of times throughout a life of quiet, dutiful service. It was a gesture of defeat, but it became one of discovery. Her fingertips, tracing the intricate patterns, snagged on a tiny, almost invisible seam hidden within the carved trim. Her heart, which had been a dull ache in her chest, gave a sharp, painful lurch. The years of silent observation, of feeling like a ghost in her own home, had trained her to notice the smallest of details, yet this had remained concealed. A flicker of impossible hope ignited within the desolation. With fingers that trembled not from sorrow, but from a sudden, sharp curiosity, she pressed against the anomaly. A soft, definitive click echoed in the silent, cavernous room as a section of the ornate paneling sprang open, revealing a hidden compartment she never knew existed. Inside, nestled in the dark recess and veiled by a thin layer of undisturbed dust, lay two objects that held the potential to change everything. A thick, leather-bound ledger, its spine stiff, and a single, sealed envelope. The elegant, familiar script on the crisp paper made her breath catch in her throat. It was her father's hand, a script she knew as well as her own. And on the front, addressed in that same hand, was her name, to Eleanor. Time itself seemed to hold its breath as their fingers, trembling slightly, broke the seal on the aged envelope. In the stillness of the room, where dust motes danced in a solitary sunbeam, the crinkle of the paper sounded like a thunderclap. This was no simple missive, no tender love note or perfunctory farewell. As their eyes scanned the familiar, yet somehow alien script of their father, a truth unfolded, so raw and devastating it threatened to unravel their entire world. The letter was a confession, a testament to a choice made in the crucible of desperation. Their father explained everything, and the neat narrative of his life's work, the celebrated histories he had penned, shattered with each word. It all began with Isabel, a name that had been a ghost in their family, and her brother. The young man had become entangled in the sudden and permanent absence of a powerful, vindictive figure from a neighboring town. The consequences were poised to be catastrophic. A violent rupture was imminent, a storm of retribution that would have not only destroyed Isabel's family, but also brought ruin upon their entire community. To avert this disaster, their father had struck a terrible bargain. He, the historian, would wield his craft not to reveal truth, but to conceal it. He would write the official history, a meticulously constructed version of events that papered over the conflict, erasing the powerful man's connection to the town and, in doing so, burying Isabel's true story forever. The books that had brought him acclaim, the very legacy the protagonist had once resented for its perceived dishonesty, were not an act of theft from the past. They were a shield, forged in secrecy to protect the innocent from a fire they could not have survived. The final lines of the letter landed with the force of a physical blow, a torrent of understanding that both broke and remade their heart. Years of perceived coldness, of an inexplicable emotional distance, were suddenly cast in a new, heartbreaking light. My coldness, my distance, he had written, was the penance I paid every day for the story I buried. It was the only way I could live with the choice I made to protect them. Please, forgive my silence. In that moment, the silence was forgiven. The years of quiet suffering became a testament to a father's impossible, selfless love. He sat for hours, the silence of the late-night study pressing in on him, heavy and absolute. The world outside the window was a dark, sleeping void, but within the small circle of lamplight, his own world was a maelstrom of indecision. The unsent letter, held in one hand, had grown soft and pliant from the anxious moisture of his palm. In the other, he felt the stiff, cold weight of the leather-bound ledger, a relic unearthed from a forgotten chest. This ledger contained everything: the damning, irrefutable proof of the deal, the precise dates and figures that could shatter a decades-old lie and rewrite history. The path forward seemed so tantalizingly clear, a straight line to retribution. He could call Silas even at this late hour. He could hear the surprise, then irritation in his voice. He could summon him to this very room, and with a quiet, deliberate movement, place the open ledger on the desk between them. He could prove, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that his father was not a plagiarist. The thought of revenge was a bitter, tempting comfort, a vision he played over and over in his mind. He would watch the smug certainty in Silas's eyes, an expression he had loathed since childhood, first flicker with confusion, then crumble into the ash of disbelief and dawning horror. In that moment of shattering revelation, he could reclaim some essential version of his father's honor, righting a wrong that had haunted his family for a generation. But as his gaze drifted from the ledger's cold, impersonal columns to the familiar handwriting on the letter he'd never send, the fire of his righteous anger cooled to embers. He saw the elegant, slightly slanted script of his father, a sight that brought a painful wave of nostalgia for a man he now realized he only partially knew. In those loops and lines he recognized not just the victim he was so desperate to vindicate, but a complex man who had his own secrets, his own carefully curated truths. He now understood that his father had built his own walls, hiding parts of himself from the world, perhaps even from his own son. The ledger exposed one great deception, but in doing so, it illuminated the disquieting possibility of countless others. Revealing this new truth would solve nothing fundamental. It would just be his story pitted against Silas's, another secret weapon in a war of narratives. It would ignite another cycle of pain and misunderstanding, a toxic legacy inherited from their fathers. The choice was no longer about honor. It was about whether to fan the flames or let the ghosts of the past find their own troubled peace. The air in the study was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, a testament to the long hours she had spent piecing together a history that had been deliberately fractured. Now, the final piece was in place. A deep, cleansing breath filled her lungs, stilling the tremor that had been a constant companion for weeks. The phone receiver, cool and solid in her hand, felt less like an instrument of communication and more like a gavel ready to call a long-adjourned court to session. Her first call was to Silas. As the line rang, she pictured him in his own study, surrounded by portraits of ancestors whose stern gazes seemed to demand an accounting. He was the keeper of his family's version of the story, a version she now knew to be tragically incomplete. When his gruff voice answered, hers met it not with hesitation, but with a newfound authority. "I have everything, Silas," she said, the words resonating with a clarity that surprised even her. It was the voice of someone who had walked through fire and emerged with the truth held firmly in hand. The whole story, not just mine or my father's, but Isabel's too. I want you and the elders of your family to come to the house." She offered no further explanation, allowing the weight of her declaration to settle. The summons was not a request, it was a necessity. After ending the call, a flicker of apprehension touched her. The next conversation would be infinitely more difficult. She dialed her son's number, her thumb hovering over the last digit for a heart-stopping moment. With Ben, the wounds were fresher, the silence between them a testament to a pain she had inadvertently caused in her search. This time, she would not plead or apologize for the distance that had grown between them. This act transcended their personal strife. "I'm going to tell the truth tomorrow," she said as soon as he picked up. The statement was unadorned, stripped of emotion. "I would really like you to be here." The silence on his end was a vast, empty space. She could almost feel him on the other side of it, warring with years of resentment and a son's reluctant love. She resisted the powerful urge to speak again, to persuade, to explain. The choice had to be his. When his voice finally came, it was quiet, subdued, but it was there. "Okay, Mom, I'll be there." As she placed the receiver back in its cradle, the click echoed in the quiet room. A profound calm washed over her, a feeling entirely new. All these months, she had been an archaeologist of sorrow, digging through the past, unearthing skeletons and secrets. The work had been necessary but destructive, breaking open, sealed-off chambers of grief. But now, with these two calls, the purpose had shifted. This wasn't about exposure anymore. It was about assembly. By bringing the key figures together under one roof, she wasn't just presenting evidence, she was creating a space for understanding, for acknowledgement. For the first time, she felt she was mending something, not just uncovering it. The gathering would not be an end, but a beginning. The warmth of the niece's hand on hers was an anchor in the quiet sea that followed the confession. A current of relief passed through the daughter, so potent it almost brought her to tears. The other niece, her expression just as gentle, nodded slowly. It was not an absolution, but an invitation. Ben, ever the silent observer, pushed himself away from the window, his presence a quiet affirmation of support at her side. Silas, a man of ledgers and law, cleared his throat, his gaze resting on the pile of papers. He suggested they begin not with the cold facts of the ledger, but with the heart of the matter, the letters. One by one, they passed the brittle pages between them. Her father's elegant, tortured script filled the room, his words of love and regret for Isabel painting a portrait of a man torn between ambition and his heart. With each letter, the nieces would add a fragment of their own, a memory of their aunt. They spoke of Isabel's unexplained melancholy in her later years, her fierce independence, and a brilliant project she had to abandon. The pieces began to fit. The tormented journal entries coincided with dates the nieces remembered as significant setbacks for Isabel. Finally, they turned to the ledger. It was, as the daughter had suspected, more than a record of debts. It was a meticulous, secret accounting of a shared intellectual enterprise. The entries detailed Isabel's contributions, theories, calculations, breakthroughs that had been foundational to the very work for which her father's awards had been won. The silence had not just hidden a love story, it had buried a legacy. Ben was the first to speak into the stunned quiet. "We can't change what he did," he said, his voice firm but kind, "but we can change what the world remembers." His idea was simple and profound. They would use the ledger to officially credit Isabel, to rewrite the history of those discoveries. They would not erase the father, but place Isabel rightfully beside him. The study, once a shrine to a singular, flawed man, was transforming into a workshop for restoring a shared, complex truth. Forgiveness was found not in forgetting, but in the collective, careful act of remembering correctly. A new book is being born within the walls of the old house, a collaborative project that has breathed profound new life into its once silent rooms. It is a story they are all writing together, a collective of minds and hearts converging on a single purpose. Silas, with his characteristic precision and meticulous nature, provides the indispensable academic rigor, his exhaustive research forming the solid, unshakable foundation upon which their narrative is built. Complementing his work, Isabel's family offers the rich, unwritten tapestry of their oral history, a vibrant collection of memories, anecdotes, and ancestral voices that give the project its vital, beating soul. And at the nexus of it all is the protagonist, acting as the essential bridge. It is her delicate task to weave the disparate threads of scholarly fact and deeply personal testimony into a single, cohesive, and resonant narrative. Ben has become a regular presence, his visits a quiet ritual of steadfast support. He spends long afternoons helping, the soft, rhythmic whir of the document scanner, a gentle and productive sound in the background. The silence that now stretches between them is no longer the cavernous, fraught emptiness of before. It has settled into a comfortable, healing quietude, a shared space of mutual understanding that requires no words to be complete. The very atmosphere of the house has been reborn. Where once it felt like a cold tomb, heavy with the oppressive weight of grief and static memory, it now thrives as a bustling, vibrant workshop. The air, once stagnant with sorrow, is now alive and charged with the rich, invigorating aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the palpable energy of a shared creative mission. The home has become a place of active creation, not just passive remembrance. This morning she performed a final symbolic act of this transformation. She entered the study and stood for a moment before the last portrait of her father. With deliberate, careful hands, she took it down, an act not of erasure, but of gentle closure. The space he occupied was not left vacant. In its place, she hung one of her own watercolors, a painting that pulsed with vibrant life. It depicted the sun's brilliant, hopeful light dancing across the rippling surface of Sachem Creek. Through this journey of reclamation, she has learned a fundamental truth. The most significant legacy is not the one handed down and passively received. It is the one a person finds the courage to actively engage with, to reshape, and ultimately to mend.